Hi everyone, it's James here. Welcome to another video. This video is going to be called Black Country Rock, and it is my tribute to the music and bands of Birmingham in England. So apologies to anybody who tuned in thinking it was going to be a David Bowie video. Obviously he did a song called Black Country Rock, but I thought I would just come on and talk about Birmingham bands because I've never actually revealed this before. But I've got a bit of a thing about Birmingham and Birmingham music. I've only actually ever been to Birmingham twice in my life, but for some reason, when I was a youngster, teenager, I kind of latched on to Birmingham music and the Birmingham tradition and the Birmingham kind of history, the band history. I'll kind of go into that and I'll explain it as we go along. So now, I'm not from Birmingham, so the phrase the Black Country, I'm not 100% certain which area that refers to. I mean, people like John Downing on the VC, people who are from Birmingham will put me straight on this, but the Black Country, as far as I'm aware, it's kind of like the West Midlands. It takes in Birmingham itself and the surrounding areas. So a classic example of a Birmingham band is this one. This is Slade and their album Slade, featuring the immortal Noddy Holder and Dave Hill. And the reason I'm showing Slade first is that they're a kind of prime example of a band which, you know, in the UK, if you grew up in the 1970s, their music was everywhere. I mean, apart from anything else, you had the Christmas hit, but apart from that, you had songs like Come On Feel the Noise, and Slade had a very distinctive, very kind of hard driving sound. They were a really influential band. They influenced lots of American acts. Kiss were owed a lot to Slade, lots of other groups as well, and there's something about the sound of Slade which sums up the kind of Birmingham sound. I think it was Noddy Holder himself who, when he was asked to try and describe what the Birmingham sound was, he said it was difficult to describe, but it was a hard sound, an uncompromising sound, very rough around the edges. I think, well, Noddy's theory was that it's something to do with the kind of hard urban environment of Birmingham itself. You know, Birmingham historically was an industrial city, and I think it was Black Sabbath, Tony Iommi from Black Sabbath, who said that as far as he was concerned, you know, Sabbath's music was a kind of oral depiction of the factories of Birmingham and just the kind of sound of heavy industry. Of course, Tony Iommi famously lost the tops of his fingers in an industrial accident in a Birmingham factory, after which he had to meld some squeezy bottle tops onto the end of his fingers so he could carry on playing the guitar. So it's such a classic story. There's something about Birmingham bands and the history of them which I just find endlessly fascinating. You know, the stories, the history behind it. I love the story of how Ozzy came to join Black Sabbath. It was a story that was told by Geezer Butler in a documentary about Sabbath. He said he was just at home one night having his tea with his mum and dad and his brother, and there was a knock at the door, and his brother went to answer it, and he came back into the living room and said, "There's something at the door for you," to Geezer. And Geezer said, "What do you mean, something?" And his brother said, "Well, go and have a look." So Geezer went to the door, and the description of Ozzy that he gave was very funny. I can't remember the specific details. I think he said he had a plimsoll on a dog lead or something like that, and he just was very kind of, you know, down at heel looking, and Geezer knew him from somewhere else. You know, he'd seen him around, and Ozzy just said, "Hello, I'm Ozzy." And the reason he'd knocked on the door was that he was replying to an advert which Geezer had put in the local music shop or something, asking for musicians, and Geezer just kind of went, "Oh no, you know, it's him." So there's the humour of the Birmingham musicians. If you hear them being interviewed, there's that great kind of accent they've got, that kind of self-deprecating humour. And then you've got the music, which, like I said, it has a very distinctive aura to it, or a very gritty, urban kind of feel. And I thought it was a really interesting comment from Tony Iommi, you know, saying that to him Birmingham music was was an evocation of the factories and the kind of urban sprawl. And so it's no coincidence, I suppose, that heavy metal was born in Birmingham. I mean, you've got Sabbath, who are probably the originators of heavy metal. You've also got bands such as Judas Priest, who are from Brum as well, Birmingham. Led Zeppelin, not exactly a Birmingham band. Robert Plant, I think, was from Kidderminster. I could be mistaken. And John Bonham was from one of the suburbs of Birmingham. I'm sure John Downing will be able to put me straight here. So there was a definite kind of Birmingham streak in Led Zeppelin, even though Jimmy Page and John Paul Jones were not from there. So it's a fairly rich heritage. If you're talking, you're talking Sabbath, you're talking Judas Priest, you're talking Slade, big influential bands. So how did I sort of zone into this? Well, the story begins in a record shop in North Wales or West Wales called Cog Records, where I used to go a lot back in my teens. I bought most of my records from there. It was a place near the seaside where we used to go on holiday with some friends who owned a caravan, a static caravan there. My parents' friend, his name was Clive, and he was much older than me. He was kind of in his 40s, probably, or late 30s, and I was maybe 14, something like that. And I was going through the racks, and as per usual, I was looking for Motors records because I'm a big fan of the Motors. And I came across this. This is The Move, and it's from the Reader's Digest. It's got The Move on one side, and then on the other side, it's got the tremolos. And this friend of my parents said, "Oh, James, you should get this. You'll love The Move. You'll absolutely love it." He said, "There's a great track called Blackberry Way on there, which is an absolutely classic British pop song, So, it was £2.50, so I took it home, bought it, and really liked it. Songs such as Night of Fear and I Can Hear the Grass Grow. I'll talk about The Move in a minute as we get into the history of them. But I started to read the liner notes here, and you can see the band here. Bev Bevan on drums, Carl Wayne on vocals, the great British songwriter Roy Wood, and Trevor Burton. They also had a guy called Ace Kefford in the band. But as I was reading the history, I gradually became aware, this was the group that eventually turned into ELO in I think it was 1972. The two bands were going simultaneously. Roy Wood decided he was going to do something different with Jeff Lynne, who joined the Move at that point. So this kind of history just kind of opened up in front of me, and there were all these different kind of strands of bands and people who played in this band and that band. And this was round about the time that I decided that Time by ELO was the greatest album that had ever been recorded. It was a kind of electro-pop masterpiece. So to find out that the band had roots in The Move, who were a very, very different kind of organisation, very different kind of band, and then to start to sort of key into the history of it all, I just found it totally fascinating. But the item that really blew my mind was not a record at all. It was a CD which I picked up somewhere. It's called A Message from the Country, Jeff Lynne, 1968 to 1973. It's on Harvest, and I went on holiday to Mallorca with my parents, and I was probably about, I think, 16, and just had this incredible holiday. And I took this CD with me, and I started to read all the liner notes, and this contains the stuff that they did together in The Move's final incarnation, which did some really interesting kind of folky, psychy kind of stuff, really original. But it also contains the music that Jeff did with the Idle Race as well. And then when you start to read about the Idle Race, you then start to get into some really interesting history. The Idle Race was the band that Jeff Lynne originally had in Birmingham in the kind of mid-1960s, and he closely tried to model the band on the kind of idea of the Sgt. Pepper Magical Mystery Tour kind of sound, with very quirky songs that were not exactly psychedelic. It was sort of a bit Syd Barrett-y, but not quite. It was more vaudeville. He used elements of kind of the fairground, and I suppose Sgt. Pepper is the roots of it. Things like Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite is a fantastic song called The Skeleton and the Roundabout, which lyrically is brilliant. It's about a skeleton who works in a fairground, and he gets a job on the ghost train, and you know, it's really, really original stuff. And there was a slightly kind of spooky atmosphere to the songs. The Idle Race never had any hits, but they were a really well-respected underground band. So I kind of started to clue into this history, and that CD just blew my mind, and I could hear that Birmingham sound as well that I've been talking about already, because the Move, let me just quickly go through the Move stuff that I have. The Move turned into a kind of underground, guitar-y, quite kind of heavy group. I've got some comps here. I used to love collecting Move comps. This is one that I used to see this on the wall of my local record shop in Wrexham. I used to hanker after it because I thought it was such a cool looking album. And then I discovered that there were lots and lots of Move compilations out there. We don't see them much anymore, but they used to be very, very common. So there's that one, and that was the original lineup of the Move, featuring Ace Kefford. The Move were managed by a guy called Tony Secundo, who was a very well-known kind of impresario in the 60s. And the Move were from Birmingham. They were just kind of Birmingham lads. And what Tony Secundo did was that he took over their management, and he moved them down to London, and he closely modelled them on The Who. And he'd seen The Who doing all this kind of wild, destructive stuff on stage, you know, with Pete Townsend smashing his guitar. So Tony Secundo said to them, we should just go one stage further. So what they used to do, they used to get broken TV sets from junkyards and so on, take them to the gig, and then Carl Wayne used to swing an axe at the TVs and smash them into pieces, and all these sparks would go flying, and absolute health and safety nightmare. And Tony Secundo used to dream up all these incredible publicity stunts, which got the band in the papers all the time. And then he went one step too far. He created a postcard that had a libelous photograph on it of the then Prime Minister, Harold Wilson. And it resulted in the band being investigated by MI5, and they were dragged in front of the High Court. It was like a kind of treasonable offence almost, and it made the front page of like every newspaper in the country. So again, there's just something about Birmingham bands, you know, that just invites this kind of very interesting, colourful history making. This is the Move's first album. I've shown these out of order, I'm sorry. This is a twofer. That was the first album they made, and then they made, the second album was Shazam, after which the lineup was already changing. Trevor Burton had left the band after an onstage fight with the drummer Bev Bevan. They were doing a gig somewhere, I think it was in Germany, and things had been brewing for a long time, and Bev ended up throwing his hi-hat at Trevor Burton and then was trying to strangle him on stage. So the band kind of started to shift in its configurations, and finally Jeff Lynne was brought in from the Idle Race. The Idle Race, even though they'd been a very well-respected band, they hadn't made any hits or anything. So he was brought in. Oh no, sorry, one more album first. Looking On was the next album, and this was the first one done with Jeff Lynne. And at this point, they'd started to take on a more kind of Sabbathy kind of sound, and this record is quite progressive, and much like heavy metal seemed to originate in Birmingham. It's not true to say that prog came from Birmingham, because prog really came from the southeast of England, but there was a definite hotbed of progressive elements in the Birmingham scene, and the Move certainly imbibed that. So that was the penultimate album, and then the final album that they did was Message from the Country, which is the record which that CD had lots of songs from. Really, really interesting stuff. Things like The Minister, which sounds a bit like Paperback Writer. I mean, Jeff Lynne was never very far from his Beatle roots, but there was something very unique in the songwriting partnership of the singing partnership of Roy Wood and Jeff Lynne. They wrote separately together, but when they sang together, it was a really, really interesting sound. If you want to check out a song that has their harmonies on, check out the song No Time from this album, which is a kind of psych folk song which has their voices interweaving. And it's kind of almost as original a sound as John Lennon and Paul McCartney. You know, it's kind of that good in a way. But then the move kind of finally did then just mutate into ELO, and when they first started, they were nothing like the pop group that they were going to turn into. This album is very dark and kind of strange progressive music. Roy Wood was playing a cello on here that he'd bought. It was a kind of cheap Chinese cello, and he couldn't play it. So he'd play sort of Hendrix riffs on it, but because he couldn't play it, he would literally play these riffs kind of one note at a time and then double track, and he was kind of assembling this mad baroque rock and roll orchestra in his mind, you know, and then translating it onto tape. And I mean that is a really interesting debut album. It's often overlooked. So that was kind of my sort of key into it. But I mean, the more I researched it, the more stuff I found. I mean, this guy, Steve Gibbons, again, an absolutely classic kind of Birmingham hard, kind of guitar-y, rough and ready kind of sound. Steve had been around on the Birmingham scene for ages, and this band actually, just like ELO grew out of the ashes of the Move, the Steve Gibbons band emerged from the ashes of the Idle Race, Jeff's old band, which had never had a hit. And when Jeff Lynne left, members kind of, you know, started to come and go, and eventually it turned into the Steve Gibbons band, featuring Trevor Burton, who had been in the Move, the guy who had almost been strangled on stage. So Steve Gibbons is a classic figure. I've been collecting his records for a long time. His band supported The Who, I think it was in 1976. But his career just got underway just as the punk thing was about to break, so his career never really kind of happened. But he's been gigging around the West Midlands ever since. I mean, we're talking 40 years. You know, I think he's nearly 80 or something now, and he still plays around the Birmingham clubs. And I just love these records. Such a great kind of cool cult artist. There's Steve there. So yeah, if you ever see any Steve Gibbons albums, pick them up, because I mean, they're not necessarily cheap or easy to find, but definitely worth a listen. So just before I finish, just one other observation, and that is the thing that I mentioned before about prog. Even though officially progressive rock comes from the southeast of England, you can't really argue with the Moody Blues, and they were another Birmingham band. This was arguably the first proper kind of classical rock album, Days of Future Past. And the Moody's history is also absolutely fascinating. They got their name, originally they were called the M&B 5 because they had some sponsorship from the beer brewer Mitchell and Buckler. So they were the M&B 5, featuring the talents of Denny Lane, who later went on to be in Wings. Denny Lane, meanwhile, had been in the band Denny Lane and the Diplomats, which had featured Bev Bevan on drums, who would later go on to be in the Move and ELO. And then Denny Lane left the band just as they were about to kind of break, and Justin Hayward came in, and then the Moody Blues kind of helped to lay the groundwork for what we know and love as early English prog. And then later on they went into a more symphonic pop direction. But I mean, certainly the first 6 or 7 Moody's albums are absolute classics, you know, in their genre, and they're really well respected groups still in their original incarnation. You know, they contain psych elements and the classical thing, and you know, the prog arrangements, and they were kind of quite an original band. I think they recorded this at about the same time that the Beatles were recording Sgt. Pepper. Of course, Sgt. Pepper got much more attention, but if you read back through the kind of histories of British rock music, the Moody's have a fairly high place at the table, and yet again a Birmingham group. So yeah. And the Moody's also had a very interesting career in America, where they were kind of hailed as being these, I think they were hailed as being prophets in a way, because their albums always had a very mysterious, prophetic kind of feel to them, you know, the kind of titles and the artwork. and a fair few American fans got it into their heads, I think, that the Moodies were this kind of new group of messiahs who knew the future, and it was quite funny because, you know, Birmingham bands have always got this very down-to-earth humour about them, and the Moody Blues was no exception, and they were all very kind of like, you know, we're just Birmingham lads. But yeah, fascinating history. So yeah, I mean, there's lots and lots of other artists. I've barely scratched the surface, but I just thought I'd show a quick, more modern one. Modern, he says, you know, only going back 30 years or 40 years now, not 50 years. But of course, Duran Duran, another Birmingham band from the 80s. Then you've got UB40, you've got Joan Armour Trading, you've got all sorts of artists from Brum, and an endlessly fascinating topic. There is a documentary out there which you can see on YouTube. It was based on Pete Frame's Rock Family Trees. Pete Frame was a guy who traced all the bands, you know, Fleetwood Mac and the history of heavy metal, and he did it in a series of kind of, you know, Rock Family Trees. And there's a very good instalment of a documentary series that was based on his book on the Birmingham scene, and it interviews all the kind of, you know, main shakers, the guys from the Move and from the Moodies, and Steve Gibbons turns up in it, and Denny Lane is in it. Really interesting. In fact, I'll try and find the link, and I'll put it down below so you can watch it. So there we go, folks. That was my little primer introduction to Black Country Rock, the music of Birmingham and the surrounding area, and I hope you enjoyed it. Take care, and I will see you soon. Bye bye.